I grew up in a house where the rules were never written down, but everyone knew exactly what they were. My brother Daniel was the golden child, 7 years older than me, tall, naturally charming, the kind of man who walked into a room and made everyone in it feel like they'd been waiting for him. My parents adored him. My aunts adored him. Neighbors, teachers, coaches, all of them. And Daniel had understood this about himself from a very young age and arranged his whole life around the assumption that it would always be true. I was the quiet one, the one who stayed in his room and read while Daniel threw parties my parents pretended not to know about. I got straight A's. He got excuses. I saved my birthday money while Daniel spent his before the week was out, and then came to ask if he could borrow mine. He'd say, "You don't mind, right?" And it was never really a question. It was just how things worked. I was 9 the first time he borrowed from me and didn't pay it back. By 15, I'd stopped keeping track. My mother's explanation never changed. He's your brother. Family helps family. My father's was silence, which over time I understood meant the same thing, just quieter. I told myself Daniel would grow up eventually, that when I needed something, he'd be there. I kept telling myself that well into my late 20s, until I had to accept that some people never grow up in the ways that matter. They just get older and find more sophisticated reasons to expect more. I left home at 18 with a scholarship, one suitcase, and a feeling I can only describe as relief, which I felt guilty about for years before I stopped. College was hard the way things are hard when there's no safety net. 2 jobs, a full course load, ramen I genuinely stopped minding after a while. I graduated with honors in accounting, which my mother found a little disappointing. She mentioned once that Daniel had always thought I should have studied something more interesting, and which I found very useful. I built a career at a financial consulting firm, became a senior analyst, saved carefully. By 26, I had a down payment on an apartment. By 28, it was mine. Nothing glamorous. 1 bedroom, a leaky faucet, a balcony with room for 2 chairs and a plant. But it was mine in a way nothing had ever been mine before. I had a life that fit, friends who showed up when I was sick, a cat named Archie who slept on my feet, a routine that was quiet and predictable and completely my own. Daniel, meanwhile, had tried 4 different careers by his mid-30s. Sales, real estate, a stint he called entrepreneurship that mostly meant asking relatives for seed money and explaining later why it hadn't worked out. 1 marriage, 1 divorce, 2 kids from a relationship after that. Lovely children I barely knew, because he moved 3 times in 5 years. When I had a problem, I dealt with it myself. I told myself for years I preferred it that way. I almost believed it. It was a Tuesday in October. I was reviewing a client's quarterly report and nearly let the call go to voicemail. I've thought about that moment a lot since. "Your brother needs help," my mother said, without saying hello. She explained the way she always explained bad news, sideways, in pieces, hoping you'd fill in the gaps yourself. Daniel had bought a house 2 years ago. Large house, ambitious mortgage. He'd lost his job 4 months back and hadn't told anyone. He'd been covering payments with credit cards. The cards were maxed. He was 3 months behind. The bank had sent letters. I asked how much he needed. She told me. I sat still for a moment, looking at the wall, doing the math. The number wasn't a gap payment. It was a significant portion of what I had saved, the kind of money that, once gone, takes years to rebuild. I told her it was a lot. She said everyone else had already given what they could, that I was the only one left. She said it gently, but she said it. I drove over that weekend fully intending to assess the situation, commit to nothing, and make whatever decision I made from practicality rather than guilt. I reminded myself of this the whole drive there. Daniel was already there when I arrived. The way he looked at me when I walked and told me everything about how he understood the situation. Not relieve the way someone is when a person they love shows up. Relieve the way a problem is when it's about to get solved. We had dinner. The conversation was careful and polite in the way it gets when everyone knows what's really on the table and nobody wants to be the one to name it. After dessert, Daniel spread out the documents, mortgage statements, credit card bills, the bank letter. I read through everything while the kitchen was quiet. "Daniel," I said when I finished, "this didn't happen overnight. It happened over months. Why didn't you tell anyone?" He shrugged, an actual shrug, and said he'd thought he'd figure it out. I asked about the credit cards. Same answer. I started to ask about the job, and he cut me off to say he'd assumed I was there to help, not interrogate him. My mother put her hand on my arm, and said he'd been through a lot. Daniel checked his phone. I should have left that night without making any promises. I agreed to help. 32 years of habit doesn't dissolve in one evening. But this time, for the first time, I put conditions on it, and I wrote them down in a 2-page document I spent Sunday night drafting, feeling alternately like a responsible adult and a terrible person for needing to. The conditions weren't harsh. They were what any bank would ask for, softened because I was his brother rather than an institution. I'd cover 3 months of mortgage payments to clear the arrears. In return, 5 job applications per week with proof. 2 of 4 credit cards canceled. Read-only access to his bank account so I could see where the money was going. And a repayment plan, agreed together, over 3 years. I put it on my parents' kitchen table Sunday morning. My mother looked uncomfortable. My father studied his coffee. Daniel read through it, then looked up like I'd said something unreasonable. He didn't like the bank account access. Called it a trust issue. I said I loved him and the conditions were fair. He said family doesn't do this. I said family also doesn't let family lose their home, that I was trying to help him, and that this was how I could do that without putting myself at real risk. He pushed the document back across the table and told me, in the tone of someone doing me a favor, that if that's how I wanted it, fine. We both signed. My mother witnessed it, pressing the pen lightly like she was hoping to make the whole thing less real. I drove home telling myself this time would be different. I had it in writing. The first month was fine. The arrears cleared. Daniel sent me 3 job application screenshots, fewer than 5, but I let it go, and he photographed a cut-up credit card and sent me the picture. I appreciated that. The second month, the application stopped. I texted him and got back. Working on some things, will send soon. He didn't send soon. I called my mother, who said he'd had a rough week. I pulled up the bank records. $40 at a sports bar. $63 at an upscale restaurant. $112 on what looked like a gaming console. Over $200 in 1 week, from a man who hadn't sent me a single job application. I called him. He said he'd been networking. I pointed out that networking and applying aren't the same thing, and that the bank records showed over $200 on non-essentials. He said he needed to decompress, that it had been stressful, that he knew I'd hold this over him. His voice had gone flat in the way it did when he'd already decided how the conversation was going to end. Here's what kept coming back to me after I hung up. I hadn't asked for much. 5 applications a week. 2 canceled cards. Honesty about spending. Month 2, he couldn't manage it. Not because life had gotten harder. Because he didn't actually think he had to. The 3rd month, Daniel called me first. He needed more money, double the monthly amount, because the house needed an emergency roof repair. He had a contractor's estimate, he said. I asked him to send it. He said he didn't have it in writing yet. I told him to get it first. That was in the agreement. He said I didn't believe him, and hung up. 3 days later, a photo of a handwritten note. R. Watts, contractor. No business name. No license number. No letterhead. A number scrawled at the bottom that matched, almost exactly, what Daniel had originally asked for. I called 2 licensed roofers in his area, described the job, got quotes. Both were significantly lower. When I told Daniel, he accused me of going behind his back, of trying to catch him in something. He said he'd handle it himself and hung up. My mother called an hour later. When I walked her through the estimate and the numbers, she suggested I might have miscalculated. When I mentioned I was a professional accountant, she said Daniel was embarrassed and I was making him feel stupid. I told her as calmly as I could that if she and my dad believed the estimate was legitimate, they were welcome to contribute toward it. What I wasn't going to do was keep sending money when the agreement was being ignored and the documentation I asked for didn't hold up to 10 minutes of basic research. I told her I wasn't an ATM. I said it out loud for the first time in my life. My hands were shaking slightly after I hung up, not from anger, but from the strange feeling of having finally said something I'd been thinking quietly for decades. 2 weeks later, my mother called a formal family meeting. My parents, Daniel, me, Aunt Clara, my mother's older sister, the family's designated authority on moral questions, and Uncle Remy, who was there primarily to nod. I drove over knowing roughly what was going to happen. My mother opened by saying there had been a misunderstanding between Daniel and me, and that the family hoped we could resolve it. She said misunderstanding very carefully, in a way that assigned no blame to anyone. Aunt Clara delivered a speech about the importance of family and advice from a pastor she knew who believed the greatest act of love was sometimes forgiving a debt. She looked at me the whole time. Bethany, whose presence I hadn't expected and whose purpose I immediately understood, contributed a story about a friendship she'd damaged by asking to be repaid, and how she'd always regretted not just calling it a gift. Daniel sat quietly with the faint beginning of a smile at the corner of his mouth. I let them finish. Then I said I wanted to make sure I understood correctly. The family had called a meeting to ask me to forgive a debt on an agreement that hadn't been honored for money given at real personal cost by someone, me, who hadn't received a single dollar of support from anyone in this room when the original crisis happened. No one disputed that. I told them I was tired of being invisible, the capable, reliable member of this family who absorbs everything, asks for nothing, and is expected to feel grateful for the arrangement. I was done accepting that role without naming it. My father set down his cup and told Daniel plainly that his brother had helped him and the conditions had been fair, and he didn't want to hear otherwise. Then he looked at me and asked if I was willing to continue, if Daniel held up his end. I looked at my brother, 40 years old, staring at the floor, and felt something tired and sad that had nothing to do with money. Then I said yes. I was willing. For 3 months after that, Daniel actually tried. 5 applications a week, sometimes more. He called once to ask if I'd look over his resume. I spent 2 hours on the phone going through it with him, and when we finished he said thank you in a way that sounded like he meant it. He got an interview, then 2, then a job offer. Not his dream, but solid and real, the kind that covered the mortgage and left something over. He called me when he accepted it, and for about 45 minutes we were 2 people who had grown up in the same house and actually liked each other. Repayment installments started arriving, smaller than agreed, but consistent, on time, with a note each month that just said, this month's payment. I let myself wonder whether the whole difficult process had actually worked. I knew, underneath that, it was probably too good to last. I just wanted to believe it wasn't. One missed payment. He texted to say he'd had an unexpected expense and would double up next month. I said okay. Next month, nothing. I followed up and got a vague reply about working on it. Then my mother called, not about the payments, but about Daniel having a rough patch at the new job. Conflict with his manager. He was thinking of leaving. He'd been there 4 months. I said he had a mortgage. She said I sounded cold. I told her he'd missed 2 payments, promised to double up, and hadn't. She suggested, very carefully, that maybe I should consider not asking for the money back. She framed it as generosity. I was doing well. For me, it was just money, whereas for Daniel, it was something more. I picked my phone back up and told her that yes, it was money. Money I had earned, saved, and given in good faith on the basis of a signed agreement, and that not asking for it back wasn't generosity. It was just losing it quietly in a way that was convenient for everyone except me. She said she understood. She said it in the voice that meant she didn't. Daniel quit 3 weeks later. I found out not because he told me, but because his direct deposits stopped showing up in the bank records he'd apparently forgotten I could still see. I called him, asked carefully whether there had been difficulties at work. He immediately wanted to know who told me, and I reminded him about the account access. A pause. He'd forgotten about that. He told me what happened. A 40-minute account of a manager who'd been unreasonable, a workplace that hadn't appreciated him. It was possible he was right. It was also possible that Daniel had arrived with certain expectations about how he deserved to be treated, found reality didn't match, and decided that was someone else's problem. I listened to all of it without interrupting, which took more discipline than I'd like to admit. When he finished, I asked what his plan was. He said he'd find something better. I asked about the mortgage. He said he had savings. When I asked how much, he said that was none of my business, and when I explained that I was asking because we had a repayment agreement and I needed to understand whether he'd be able to continue, he said he was going through a hard time and couldn't believe I was making it about money. Then his voice shifted, and he told me my fundamental problem, the one I'd always had, was that I'd never struggled, never failed, never needed anyone, and had spent my whole life looking down at people who had. He brought up Christmas 2 years ago, when I hadn't come home, asked if I knew what that had done to my parents. I had missed that Christmas because I'd had a flu serious enough to call a doctor. 5 days in bed. I'd sent gifts, called everyone, explained. I told him this. He said I always had an excuse. I said again, I had been sick. He said he was done talking about money and that it was embarrassing to be asked about it, and hung up. I opened a document and started writing everything down. Dates, amounts, messages, bank records, the signed agreement. I didn't know exactly what was coming, but I knew I was going to need receipts. My mother's birthday dinner, 3 weeks later. I almost didn't go. Not because of the occasion. I wanted to be there for her, but because of the feeling I'd developed over decades, the low-grade sense that something is waiting at the end of the evening that isn't on the official agenda. I went anyway. The table told the story before anyone opened their mouth. Aunt Clara, Bethany, Uncle Remy, Daniel with his kids, genuinely lovely children, the kind that make you think maybe some things turn out okay despite everything. I messed around with my nephew and niece for a while, gave my mother her gift, helped carry dishes, allowed myself to think maybe I'd read it wrong. After dessert, once the kids were settled in the back room, my mother said she wanted to talk with everyone about a few things. And there it was. 2 months earlier there had been a formal family meeting, and I'd walked into that one knowing exactly what it was. This was different. This was my mother's birthday dinner, a place I'd driven to out of love, and the same script was playing out inside it. Aunt Clara's speech, Bethany's story, my mother's careful language, but I hadn't been summoned this time. I'd been welcomed in somewhere I felt safe, and then the floor had been moved. I let them finish. Then I looked at my mother and said, quietly, "You set this up at your birthday dinner." Not an accusation, just a fact I needed to name. She didn't deny it. I didn't give a speech. I didn't list grievances or explain the pattern or ask anyone to acknowledge anything. I just said, "I love all of you. I have spent my whole adult life being the person in this family who doesn't need anything. I'm not doing that anymore. Not because I've stopped loving any of you, because it was never actually true." I hugged my mother, said happy birthday, said goodbye to the kids, and walked to the door. Daniel caught up with me in the hallway. We stood there, just the two of us, the kids' movie muffled in the background. He said I'd embarrassed him. I said he'd used his mother's birthday dinner. He didn't argue. After a moment, he said quietly that he didn't have the money, that he wasn't going to be able to pay me back, not anytime soon. He said it without deflection or performance, just the plain fact of it. I told him I'd suspected as much for a while. He asked what I actually wanted from him. I thought about it before answering. What I wanted was simple. I wanted him to understand that what I'd given him had cost me something real. Not a parade, not permanent gratitude, not a debt he'd carry forever. Just the acknowledgement that it had mattered, that I had given up something, and it was worth knowing that. He was quiet for a long time. Then, in a voice I hadn't heard from him before, smaller, stripped of its usual certainty, he said, "It mattered. It did matter to me." I thanked him. I meant it. I walked to my car, sat in the dark for a few minutes, and drove home. Daniel found another job about 6 months later, a better one, as it turned out. He started making payments again, smaller than we'd agreed, but regular, always on time. He never says much when he sends them. Neither do I. We see each other at family events. We are polite, sometimes genuinely warm, and we both understand that the closeness we never quite built isn't going to appear now, in our 40s, on top of everything that happened. We are not hostile. We are two people who share a history and have decided, quietly, not to make it worse. My mother and I had a long conversation 6 months after the birthday dinner. I said things I'd been holding for years. She told me she knew she hadn't always been fair to me. She didn't say why. I didn't ask. There are explanations that won't change anything even if you get them, and I've made peace with not having that one. My apartment is still mine. The balcony, the 2 chairs, the plant that has somehow outlasted everything. Archie is 8 and has strong opinions about breakfast timing, which I respect. The life I built is intact, and I have something now I didn't have before any of this started. Not wisdom, not peace, nothing elevated. Just the ability to say no. Without a long explanation. Without apologizing after. No is a complete sentence. I always knew that. It just took 32 years, a signed document, 2 ambushes, and a quiet conversation in a hallway to say it like I meant it.